Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tim Fortier. I'm the Communications Coordinator with New Hampshire Municipal Association, and thank you for joining us for this 2021 webinar series. In particular today, specifically how public services are funded in New Hampshire. We are joined today and delighted to be joined today by Phil Sletten, who's the Senior Policy Analyst with the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. Good afternoon, Phil.
Good afternoon, Tim.
And we have NHMA's Government Finance Advisor, Becky Benvenuti, who will follow up on the second part of this presentation today. Good afternoon, Becky. And I'm sure she says hello.
Good afternoon, Tim.
Thank you, Becky. We are delighted that our members have joined us for this webinar today. As you may know, you've been muted upon entry, but if you do want to communicate with our panelists, we ask that you do that through the chat line. We will be entertaining questions if they pertain to a particular slide. We will try to get those answered by our panelists at that time. If not, general questions in nature will be reserved for the tail end of the presentation. So we hope you'll stick around for that Q&A period. And with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Phil Sletten, again, Senior Policy Analyst with New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you, Tim, and thank you for the opportunity, and a good barely afternoon to everyone joining us on the call. Thank you for your time in advance. So I'll note that the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, where I work, is a non-profit independent policy research organization based in Concord. We look at state budget and revenue policy, state tax policy, and the state economy, and with a particular focus on economic security, particularly for low and moderate income granite staters. And I want to talk to you today about how public services are funded in New Hampshire, and I hope everyone can see my screen. And in answering that question, I'm going to ask a series of questions that sort of lead us into that and allow us to sort of set the stage for what funding public services looks like in New Hampshire generally, and what some of the particular challenges that we see around the COVID-19 crisis and some of the things that we see in this state budget process look like. So first, how has COVID-19 impacted New Hampshire? And I'm sure we all know on an individual basis how we have been impacted in New Hampshire as individuals, but on a macro level, what has it looked like? And what does it look like for households? What does it look like for the state? And we see, in particular, relative to household economic security, that the impacts were fairly swift and massive and are ongoing. There are still impacts even from those early days of the COVID-19 crisis. So to provide some context, between mid-February and mid-April, there was a drop of about 22% of New Hampshire residents who were working in mid-February were not working in mid-April. And that is a massive drop in employment, and very sharp and very sudden. And that led to some other statistics that reflect that drop in employment. About, from a different source, close to half of New Hampshire households lost employment income between mid-March and mid-July. There was some loss of employment income during that time period. And even if we look at more recent data, the more recent data that's collected by the US Census Bureau, nearly 1 in 4 adults in New Hampshire indicated that it was somewhat or very difficult to pay for usual household expenses in the prior 7 days, and that's as of late January. So this is, even though a lot of jobs have come back, even though there has been a fair bit of economic activity that has picked up since the early days of the pandemic, still nearly 1 in 4 households in New Hampshire were having trouble paying for those usual expenses. And the Census Bureau offered examples in this survey question of whether it's mortgage payments or rental payments or car payments, student loans, food, all of those would be those usual household expenses included. And even that 1 in 4 figure, that nearly 1 in 4 figure, is down from 1 in 3 in early December. And that was notably before the latest $600 economic impact payments from the federal government and enhancements at the federal level to unemployment compensation, which have likely helped that picture a fair bit. Now, I mentioned some of those federal policies. There has been a significant amount of federal assistance from the federal government flowing to New Hampshire. That assistance to individuals and families comes in the form of enhanced and expanded unemployment compensation, the economic impact payments. So that's in the more recent legislation, the $600 impact payments, and back in the spring, $1,200 impact payments per person. And then food assistance enhancements as well, particularly in the most recent round of legislation. And then way back early in the spring, there were some adjustments as well, or in the winter of 2020, I should say, there were some adjustments as well. And there were also grants to businesses. So the payroll protection program is one many of you may be familiar with. There are disaster loans to businesses as well. There has also been aid to governments. The Coronavirus Relief Fund is what the formal name for the $1.25 billion in relatively flexible funding that the state received from the CARES Act was. There's also emergency rental assistance from the latest round of federal legislation. Local public education aid as well, aid to higher education institutions and other private education institutions. And then other grants that are for specific purposes to state and local governments have been passed by the federal government as well. There are also release funds to healthcare providers, so going directly to healthcare providers during the pandemic. Now, what does that look like in aggregate? Well, it totals, based on the best estimates that I've seen, totals over $9 billion has flowed to New Hampshire in COVID-19 related federal aid. And you can see the large green slice on the pie here. The light green slice is the payroll protection program and aid to other businesses. That's about a third of the total that we've seen that's flowed to New Hampshire, to entities and individuals in New Hampshire. There's also the enhanced unemployment compensation, the CARES Act coronavirus relief funds, the economic impact payments. Those are all about $1.25 billion each, with healthcare assistance to healthcare providers, emergency rental assistance, K-12 funds or K-12 fund education aid, I should say, balancing out the remainder, as well as you can see that large gray slice, other grants to state and local governments for specific purposes, other grants or aid for specific purposes, or to support liquidity also through the Federal Reserve. So one thing about this federal assistance that I think is worth noting is that a lot of this federal aid, the large part of this federal aid cannot be used to offset state budget and local budget shortfalls. So for example, in particular, some of the most flexible aid on here that went to governments, the coronavirus relief funds that went to the state, the $1.25 billion, that explicitly could not be used for previously budgeted expenditures. So a revenue shortfall could not be backfilled by those federal funds. There are some federal funds that have helped offset revenue shortfalls, but in large part, a lot of this aid has not been that sort of general revenue shortfall assistance. So the state government was really watching what the budget shortfall would be, especially as we entered the pandemic. Over time, the estimates, which were initially quite large as to what the shortfall would be in the state general and education trust funds, over time, those estimates have gotten better, particularly for, as you see on this graph, for state fiscal year 2021. And it's really when agencies and legislators were estimating what the shortfalls would be for this fiscal year, the second year of the state budget biennium. The estimates were, $200 million, $300 million, $400 million down. And really, since November, those figures have improved. And indeed, the governor estimated that there would actually be a $31 million surplus relative to what the state budget planned for state fiscal year 2021 when he announced his budget proposal on the 11th. This is a 2-year budget, so this is just looking at the second year. What does it look like in aggregate? Here you can see the total balance, right, relative to the beginning of the state budget biennium back in June of 2019. What does revenue look like? And you can see at the end of state fiscal year 2020, so the first half of calendar year 2020, we saw a really significant drop in state revenues. But since then, revenues have recovered because of the surpluses that have been run thus far in state fiscal year 2021. So it's actually closing the gap, and the budget could end in a balance despite this a really dramatic drop in revenues that we saw. And some of that is because that $9 billion flowing to the from the federal government into the state economy has likely helped support the economy quite a bit. And that in turn has in some ways supported state tax revenues. So you might be saying at this point, okay, so revenues are moving around, but when we're talking about the general fund, the education trust fund, what revenue sources are we talking about? What are the primary ways in which the state collects revenue? And I want to walk you through some of the tax revenue sources and also mention some of the non-tax revenue sources as well. So first, we'll start with an overview of what are some of the largest tax revenue sources the state has, and we'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail, except for one. The business profits tax is the largest tax revenue source the state has, and while it's an estimate, it's close to $500 million was collected in state fiscal year 2020. The statewide education property tax is the next largest one that's on the books for in terms of state revenue. The meals and rentals tax is rounding out those that collect more than collected more than $300 million. The Medicaid enhancement tax, which I'll just talk about briefly here, that is a charge, that is a tax levied on charges that hospitals make for services. So hospitals pay that, but they do see some of the revenue from that they pay come back in the form of disproportionate share payments, which offset uncompensated care that hospitals pay for patients who come in who are enrolled in Medicaid or who are not do not have health insurance. Then the business enterprise tax is the next largest, followed by the tobacco tax, rounding out those that raised more than $200 million. The motor fuels tax, which is on gasoline and diesel fuel, as well as aviation fuel, comes next. The real estate transfer tax, the insurance premium tax, and the interest and dividends tax round out what we'll talk about today, but know that there are a fair number of other tax revenue sources that are significant but smaller than are on this list. There are also non-tax revenue sources that are relatively significant for the state, the most significant being federal funds. So these are grants from the federal government. And you can see that totaled about $2.9 billion in state fiscal year 2020. Now, half of about $500 million came from those coronavirus relief funds that came directly to the state. And that were booked in state fiscal year 2020. There are also likely other grants that may be pandemic related that support that number, but federal grants being above $2 billion is what we would expect in the state budget for state fiscal year 2020. So it's a really significant revenue source for the state. Sales from the Liquor Commission at state liquor stores totaled close to $750 million, with about $142 million in 2020 used as operating profits from those activities, and they were used for other state purposes. And then lottery commission sales were about $400 million, and about $100 million of that went to the education trust fund, again, the profits after expenses and winnings. And then turnpike tolling is collected through tolls on certain state highways that are used to fund the oversight, maintenance, repair of the 89 miles of turnpike in the state that are overseen by the Bureau of Turnpikes of the Department of Transportation. So I noted the federal grants are an important part of the pie. And taking a look at that state budget pie, we can see that it's actually the largest slice of what was expected when the state budget is broken out by funds. Now, what are funds? And state legislators are often thinking about the state budget in terms of where the revenue comes from by fund. Funds sort of act like accounts. The money comes in from various sources and goes out for various purposes. Federal funds, as you can see here, the blue slice of the pie is the largest single slice. And that was about 30% of the planned state budget expenditures for state fiscal year 2021. So back in 2019, when the budget was passed, this is what was planned. And those are federal transfers. Those are dollars from the federal government. But the funds do interact with one another. So federal funds, for example, the amount of federal funds that are expected to be pulled down do depend in part on general funds and how general fund dollars are deployed. So these funds do interact with one another. The general fund slice, you can see, is the next largest slice in that light green. That interacts with the education trust fund as well. So the general fund is the most flexible. Dollars that are generally produced by state tax revenue and other state generated revenue sources. Legislators have the easiest time, if you will, in terms of setting up legal infrastructure to move those funds from one budget line to another, from biennium to biennium. But the general fund does interact with the education trust fund as well. The education trust fund is where those the adequate education grants that go to local governments to pay for local public education, those are held in the education trust fund. And if the education trust fund has a shortfall because it owes dollars on a per pupil basis to eventually to school districts to fund local public education, If there's a shortfall in the education trust fund's revenue sources, then the general fund backfills that shortfall. And the general fund and education trust fund share a lot of revenue sources as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, I do want to highlight some of the other funds, the highway funds and turnpike funds, for example. A lot of the revenue that flows to the highway funds comes from gasoline and motor vehicle tax and fee revenues. Those are actually constitutionally protected by the New Hampshire state constitution. Those have to be used for highway related purposes. And lottery revenues also that I mentioned earlier, those are dedicated to state education aid in the state constitution. So the profits generated from that have to go to the education trust fund. There are other revenues that are protected by statute in terms of where those dollars go, but statute is easier to change than a constitutional amendment, for example. So I wanted to highlight those that are protected by the state constitution. So remember here the green slice and the orange slice, the general fund and the education trust funds. We'll go back to those in a moment. But I want to talk about what's in that federal fund slice briefly, since it is the largest slice in the pie. One of the most important programs and the largest program the state operates, which that operates jointly with the federal government, is Medicaid. Medicaid provides health coverage for people with low incomes and limited means. And it was approximately a $2.1 billion program in state fiscal year 2020. And more than half of that total was federal funds. This is a federal matching program. And Medicaid provided coverage for about 214,000 Granite Staters as of the end of January 2021. And that, if you compare it to the February 2020 numbers, that's about a 20% increase, so a significant increase during the pandemic. But Medicaid, while it's a large program and a multifaceted program, there are other program areas that are really significant that receive federal funding in the state budget. There's a bevy of transportation aid programs that are federally funded, certain education aid, not a large percentage of education funding overall in New Hampshire, but a certain education aid around special education, school meals, professional development, those are federally supported as well. There are grants that are environmental grants related particularly to water and water infrastructure. There's funding through the Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as the Food Stamp Program here in New Hampshire. All those benefits are federally funded. The Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program is also federally supported. Temporary Assistance for Needy Families is a block grant. The state receives dollars from the federal government to deploy under to meet the goals of the program. There's certain veterans care aid and the state fuel assistance program are supported by the federal government, particularly the LIHEAP program, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, provides federal funds for the state fuel assistance program. And there are many other areas that are supported by federal funds in the state budget. So this is just to provide you with an example. But let's go back to the general fund and the education trust fund, those green and orange slices on those fund and that funds pie chart. Where does the revenue come from for those? And I mentioned a fair bit of those revenue sources are shared. Here you can see the pie chart that shows which revenue sources are shared between those two funds, or which at least support one of those funds. And you can see that it's a relatively diverse picture. You might recognize a lot of the revenue sources that we mentioned as some of the largest state revenue sources, but there are also ones that aren't in here. But you can see that there are only 4 slices that are larger than 10% of the pie as a whole. Now, that's not to say that the lottery commission, the interest and dividends tax, the insurance premium tax, liquor commission are not a significant portion. I mean, if we're talking about the latter 3 of that list, there are $1 and $20 that go to the general fund and the education trust fund. So they're all significant. But the 4 largest slices are the meals and rentals tax, the statewide education property tax, which we'll talk about more, and then the 2 business taxes together are the largest slices on the pie. And you'll see that I've shaded the 2 business taxes together. They're really very different taxes, but they are filed together typically. They're also typically analyzed together, and the revenue from them isn't separated out until all the returns are in, which can take some time. Now, I'll mention those 2 primary business taxes are the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax. The business profits tax is really more like your typical state corporate income tax. It's based on gross business profits, as well as adjustments, particularly a credit for business enterprise tax paid by a company, and apportionment, which is how the revenue, how a multi-state entity identifies revenue that is owed based on New Hampshire activity and then is taxable under the New Hampshire tax statutes. The tax base in 2018 was likely about $6.6 billion, just to give you a sense of the size of the pool of economic activity. The business profits tax supports the general fund, and a fixed portion goes to the education trust fund that's smaller than the general fund portion. And in recent years, there have been a series of rate reductions. So for most of the century to 2015, the rate was 8.5%, and it's been reduced to steps over time to the 7.7% that it is today. Now, unlike the business profits tax, the business enterprise tax is actually relatively unique among state business taxes. It's based on compensation or interest paid or accrued and dividends paid by entities, including adjustments such as credits and apportionment as well. As a result of that much broader tax base, which again includes compensation that businesses pay, the tax base itself is much broader, likely about $34 billion as of 2018. And revenue from the BET supports the general fund, and a larger portion supports the education trust fund. And there have been a series of rate reductions on the same schedule as the business profits tax, from about 0.75% down to 0.6% today. So how have revenues trended for these two tax revenue sources over time? Well, this is roughly what the picture looks like if you adjust for inflation over time, and going back to 2002. You can see prior to the Great Recession, where we saw a drop off in 2009, that revenues were rising even after you adjust for inflation, but then stayed low for a while in the first half of that, of the second decade of the, or in the last decade, I should say. In that first half, we saw really slow economic growth in New Hampshire, and it didn't start to pick up until the middle of the decade. And that started being reflected in the tax revenue in about 2016. 2018, 2019, we saw the impacts from the federal tax overhaul, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That spurred a lot of repatriated dollars from multinational entities that had dollars overseas. When those dollars were brought back to the United States, some of those were captured in the business profits tax. So that's why we see a bump up there in particular. And then there was a drop off in 2020 from the early impacts of the COVID-19 crisis in particular. So who's paying business profits tax? Let's dig into that a little bit. I mentioned some of those larger entities, especially multinational entities. Let's dig into that a little bit with this table. So this table over on the left column shows the total taxable amount of business profits that every entity had to have at least to be in the percentage of filers in the middle column, and the percentage of total revenue paid over on the right. So you can see that for entities that paid at least $0, that was 100% of filers, right? That's or had at least $0 in their tax base, that was 100% of filers. And if you move up, you'll see that 3/4 of filers didn't actually owe any business profits tax. So they had to file to meet a legal threshold. Maybe they applied a business enterprise tax credit against their business profits tax liability. But really, I want to take you up to the top of the chart, where you can see the businesses that had a taxable business profits of at least $12.6 million owed to New Hampshire. And you can see that was about 0.1% of filers. If you move all the way over to the right, you'll see that that 0.1% of filers paid almost half of the business profits tax revenue collected. Again, the state's largest tax revenue source from this 0.1% of filers. Now, if we move down one row, you'll see that 0.82% of filers paid between 3/4 and 4/5 of all the revenue collected by the business profits tax in tax year 2018, which is the most recent year that we have this data breakdown for. So that gives you a sense of the tax base. Again, those larger entities are really important for the tax base, pay a large share of the revenue. Let's look at that a different way. If we look at the filers by type, so entities that are filing to pay business profits tax, what are they identifying as the type of business? So you can see proprietors and corporations on here, as well as partnerships. But that orange slice, those water's edge filers, those tend to be multi-state, multinational, particularly large multinational entities. And they have, based at least on the statute, they have some overseas component. So you can see they were 6% of filers. But if you look at the percentage of revenue that they paid, it was more than half the revenue in state fiscal year 2018, or pardon me, in tax year 2018. So again, keeping the same colors here, you can see that those water's edge filers were a really significant part of the tax base. And that's part of the reason why the repatriation of dollars from overseas did boost revenues for the business taxes a fair bit. Now, let's look at the same table for the business enterprise tax, just to give you a sense of how it's a much broader tax base. You can see here that of the filers, about half of them didn't actually owe any business enterprise tax, but did have to file. But so that's smaller than the 3/4 in the business profits tax. And if you go up to the third row in the table, you can see 0.81% of filers paid about a little more than half of the revenue in the business enterprise tax. So still a significant portion, but smaller than that 0.82% of the business profits tax filers that paid around 78% of the revenue. So that gives you a sense of how the tax bases are different. Now let's move on to some of the other tax revenue sources. The statewide education property tax was established in the late 1990s to support the education trust fund and adequate education grants. It is set to raise $363 million, so the rate is set to raise that amount. It was set to that in 2005. That value does not adjust for inflation. So you can see in the graph on the bottom, which is inflation adjusted, we see the statewide education property tax is a declining source of real revenue, if you will, of revenue, of the purchasing power of that revenue over time. And the state requires local governments to raise this revenue, but it is not collected by the state. It is retained locally. It was at one point collected by the state, particularly for towns and cities that generated more revenue than was needed to offset the state's liability in terms of the adequate education grants owed to local governments to fund local public education, but not after 2011. After 2011, the local governments that fell into that category would keep the revenue and would be able to use it, but would have to use it on education. The meals and rentals tax is the second largest tax revenue source the state actually collects revenue from. And it's a 9% tax levied on most purchases of food and beverages from restaurants and also hotel room and car rentals. It was 8%, but then raised during the Great Recession to support state revenues. It funds the education trust fund, just the rentals cars portion. Most goes to the general fund. Certain school building aid is supported. There is a portion that's to support the State Travel and Tourism Development Agency, although that has been suspended over time. And then municipalities as well are set to get 40% of the revenue in state statute, 40% of the revenue the state collects through the meals and rentals tax, distributed on a per capita basis. And I know Becky will talk about this more in her portion as well. There have been intervening statutes that have reduced that amount over time. And you could see in the second half of the last decade, this was actually a significant source of revenue generation for the state, of revenue growth for the state, because again, this graph is inflation adjusted. So you can see that revenue from the meals and rentals tax growth was outpacing inflation. However, in 2020, you can see the effects of the COVID-19 crisis, which have been most dramatic and lasting on the meals and rentals tax receipts. The tobacco tax is relatively simple in that it's $1.78 per 20 cigarette pack. That's where most of the revenue comes from. The rate is adjusted proportionally for pack size. The rate is also not adjusted for inflation, so that $1.78 is a fixed amount. There's also a percentage tax on the wholesale price of other tobacco products, as well as a different percentage on e-cigarettes and certain related nicotine products related to e-cigarettes, that is. You can see in the graph there has been changes over the last 25 years in both the rate and the base, and that has affected revenue. And revenue from the tobacco tax supports the general fund and the education trust fund. So the real estate transfer tax is one that has moved with the economy in the past, although we see some interesting things now during the COVID-19 crisis with a lot of people moving to New Hampshire or buying homes in New Hampshire at least. And both the volume and the transaction values are up. And that has actually boosted the real estate transfer tax, because what the real estate transfer tax is a tax on the transaction value of real estate or interest in real estate that is levied on both the buyer and the seller. So both the buyer and the seller technically pay this tax. And it supports the education trust fund. The rest goes to the general fund. A certain portion of the fees associated with the paperwork for the real estate transfer tax go to support the Land and Community Heritage Investment Program as well. The insurance premium tax is levied on insurers based on the premiums that they charge. It's 1.25%, except it's 2% for certain categories, including health. This supports the general fund, as well as a portion that is generated by the expanded Medicaid program in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Granted Advantage program. Revenues generated from that go to support that program's trust fund and the state portion of the cost share for that portion of Medicaid. The motor fuels tax is a 22.2 cent per gallon tax on motor fuels, although aviation is taxed at a different rate. There are also surcharges for oil spill cleanup that add on to that 22.2 cents, but those aren't part of this tax. The revenues for this can be used for highway-related purposes. As I mentioned, there's a constitutional restriction on them. There are other restrictions for certain portions of the motor fuels tax as well that are set up in statute. And revenues go to the highway fund and are used for interest on highway bonds and notes, as well as operations. The big change that you can see in the graph here, which again is inflation adjusted, and the dollar amount, that's the tax per gallon, isn't adjusted for inflation. You can see that between 2014 and 2015, there was a rate increase by 4.2 cents per gallon, and that's most of that impact there. You can see the COVID-19 crisis impacted revenues in 2020 as well. The interest and dividends tax is a tax on certain types of income that is paid by individuals, joint filers, certain companies, and partnerships. This income is from interest, dividend, and distribution income, typically from assets such as stocks, but also money market accounts and interest-generating accounts. There is a filing threshold of $2,400 that's doubled for joint filers, and there is an additional exemption that's for older adults, individuals who are blind, and also people who have disabilities that don't allow them to work. And this tax generated about $126 million for the general fund in state fiscal year 2020. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the interest and dividends tax base as well. So this is the same table that we saw for the BET and the BPT, set up in the same way as those business tax tables. So if you look all the way over on the left, you can see the amount of taxable interest and dividend income by filer category here, or by filer tier. And this is just interest and dividends income that's taxable, so not including capital gains, not including salaries and wages. If you go up to the 200,000 line, you can see that represents the percentage of filers, or the portion of filers who have $200,000 or more in taxable interest and dividend income that was taxable under New Hampshire's IND statute. And it's a little less than 2.5% of filers, but that portion of filers paid almost half of the tax revenue in tax year 2018. So high income and high asset individuals, remember they had assets that generated $200,000 a year in income, are a really important part of the interest and dividends tax base. So that's a quick rundown of some of the state tax revenue sources. And there's more that we didn't get to, but that are smaller tax revenue sources. I tried to give you the highlights on some of the larger ones. How does that compare to local revenues? What does the picture look like at the local level versus the state level? Well, let's make sure when we're talking about local governments, we know what we're including here. It's municipal governments that you all are much more familiar with than I am. So towns and cities in New Hampshire, as well as school districts and county governments. We're also including those when we talk about local revenue. And you'll see in the pie chart here, this is a pie chart from the US Census Bureau. It's the Survey of State and Local Government Finances for state fiscal year 2018. Now, I do worry a little bit about some of the US Census Bureau data. There appears to be some double counting, particularly around the statewide education property tax being counted potentially as both a state and a local revenue source. So that's something to know when we're looking at these US Census Bureau data. But these do allow for sort of standardized comparisons across states, which is one of their advantages. And you could see here that local tax revenue made up close to 60% of all tax revenue collected by state and local governments in New Hampshire. And interestingly, that's about the reverse of what we see if we take all state revenue and all local revenue nationwide. It's about 42% of the revenue, the tax revenue is collected by local governments, and the remaining 58% collected by state governments. So it's a different picture in New Hampshire on that front. So let's look at just the state and local pies. How do those compare? You can see it's a relatively diverse picture on the state pie on the left in terms of the types of taxes, and indeed there are many different types of taxes within, for example, other selective sales in that other category. The property tax there includes the statewide education property tax and the utility property tax. If you look on the right side, it's basically the property tax. That is the local tax revenue source, with a couple other much smaller sources included in there as well. So that's just tax revenue. What about all revenue? What about looking at revenue overall? So here we can see, and this is counting tax and non-tax revenue for local governments, the property taxes still make up more than half. Property taxes still make up more than half. The state tax, the state grants make up a little under a quarter in that blue slice, and federal grants are a much smaller portion, whereas other revenue sources make up, again, the balance there. And then again, these Census Bureau data are, I have some questions about them, but if we compare it to, for example, school district revenue at the local level in New Hampshire, we see that it's a pretty similar picture. So that gives us a little bit more confidence in the numbers. Here we can see local tax, the green slices are property taxes that are raised and retained locally. So that includes local taxation as well as the statewide education property tax. The blue slices are other state grants. So the statewide education property tax is is counted as a state grant here, but this recognizes that it's raised and retained locally. So the blue slices don't include that. And then federal sources are about 5% as well. So we've talked a fair bit about how the property tax fits into the picture. How does it compare to some of those key state tax revenue sources? Well, if we take a look at property taxes relative to the largest state tax revenue sources, you can see that property taxes dwarf it overall. You can see that I did include the statewide education property tax on the top, bringing property taxes that are levied locally to about $4 billion in tax year 2020, which is much larger than for example, the business profits tax, the largest state tax revenue source. And if you look at the picture in aggregate, again, going back to those Census Bureau data, you can see that property taxes are more than half of the tax revenue collected by state and local governments in aggregate. And the state government sources, basically the state government sources balance out the rest of that, whereas property taxes are, close to, maybe not quite 2/3, but definitely more than half of the revenue collected from taxes by state and local governments in New Hampshire. Now, one thing I've noted is that the business taxes are an important part of the picture at the state level, and you can see that they're a significant portion of the slice here. What do the payments made by businesses in New Hampshire look like? What types of taxes do they pay to state and local governments? So you can see that the corporate taxes, if we look at this study from the Council on State Taxation, which looks at all the dollars paid by all businesses in New Hampshire and estimates the amount that's paid to each tax revenue source. You can see that the business profits and the business enterprise taxes together in that orange slice are a significant portion. They're almost a quarter, more than $1 in $5 paid by all businesses in aggregate go to the business profits and business enterprise taxes. But property taxes are about half, maybe slightly more than half. It depends on exactly which year of these data you look at, but it's about half to slightly more in recent years. And this is not necessarily the tax bill for each individual business, right? This doesn't reflect all businesses individually, but it reflects them in aggregate, and shows that property taxes are still a significant portion of the revenue that's paid by businesses, even though those business taxes are really important to the state's revenue picture. So we've talked, and you've seen a couple slides that show pie charts that show slices of pies that are local government revenue that comes from state grants. So how do these state and local budgets interact, and how they interacted over time? Well, let's take a look first at non-education aid. So if you look at education aid to municipality, or pardon me, non-education aid to municipalities, and see that it's and see what it looks like in inflation-adjusted fashion, you can see it's been a declining picture overall, particularly since the Great Recession. After the Great Recession, we saw the blue portion, the retirement contribution to police and firefighters, disappear. We saw the environmental grants haven't gotten back to those purchasing power levels that we saw prior to the Great Recession, those inflation-adjusted levels. Highway funds bounce around a little bit more. There has been a little bit more aid there in recent years, as well as in tax revenue sharing. We see an uptick, particularly in state fiscal year 2020, based around policy decisions that the state made. But it is a declining overall picture. And in recent years, there's been some coming back, but not to those pre-recession levels. And if you look at the axis, the y-axis, so it goes from 0 to $250 million. That's what we're talking about here in non-education aid. If we go to education aid, you can see the axis is a much different picture, right? It goes from 0 to $1.4 billion. So that's important to remember when looking at these graphs. This is also, we also see, if we adjust for inflation, a decline in revenue here. And particularly those adequate education grants are driven by enrollment, and enrollment in school districts in the state peaked in about 2002 or 2003. So we would expect to see some declines just because of demographics. And you see that in that green bar in particular. Other education aid does decline as well. In state fiscal year 2020, there was a little bit of a bump up. Again, that's due to some state policy changes particular to this current state budget. Now, folks on this call know much more about what the impacts of COVID-19 have been, of the COVID-19 crisis have been on municipal budgets. I'll note that I think there's a fair bit of evidence that federal assistance has supported the economy overall. One of the ways that it's likely provided support to municipal budgets is that helping to keep those property tax payments flowing by providing assistance to individuals and households, particularly the unemployment compensation, the economic impact payments. I'm suspecting that those have been a key part of the picture. But unlike the state government, which saw a really acute sort of short-term impact on revenues, and we may see some lingering long-term impacts, I think the long-term impacts at the local level may be more significant, and maybe more significant in a relative sense as well, particularly when we're talking about changes to property tax bases. What happens with residential and commercial property values? We can imagine a scenario now where residential values may increase, and we've seen them increase. Commercial property values may go the other direction, but it's really hard to know because we don't know what this economic recovery is going to look like. This is not the usual sort of economic shock that we see, not a usual recession. So it's hard to know what the trajectory of the recovery is going to be and how that impacts property values. And I'm sure that many of you have seen already increased local welfare assistance needs depending on what the recovery looks like and who is included in the recovery and how fully. Those may be continued for a long time. So that increased need may linger for quite a bit of time. So in this current state budget process that we've just entered, there are some key factors to keep in mind as we're thinking about what the next state budget might look like. The shortfall is much smaller than was anticipated in the early days of the pandemic. So that's significant. That means there's less of a deficit, if any deficit, that will be carried forward into the next state fiscal year and into the next state budget, but the needs are likely to be higher. So even though we are reaching a budget balance, there may be in the next state budget higher needs because people are still suffering from the public health crisis associated with the pandemic and the economic impacts as well. Policymakers at the state level also have timing flexibility as well as more resource flexibility than was anticipated earlier. And that timing flexibility comes in the form of a 2-year budget window. So policymakers can shift resources as long as the plan for the next state budget balances by June of 2023. Policymakers can allocate resources in different ways temporally between now and then. And federal funding has played a really critical role in funding state operations and state responses to COVID-19, but most of the funds have not been able to directly fill state and local budget shortfalls thus far during the pandemic. That may change. We may see more federal legislation that does provide more general assistance to state and local governments for that. But either way, continued federal action is key in both meeting short-term needs and aiding the long-term recovery. And that federal assistance to states and state decisions around revenue collection, so changes to taxes at the state level, for example, that can impact state funding for local governments. You saw how important a piece of the pie the state budget pie chart, the federal slice was. If that changes, then that potentially impacts the amount of revenue available to the state and potentially impacts how state policymakers think about revenue going to local governments. And their state tax policy decisions also impact how much revenue they have that can go to local governments as well. And it's important to remember, and I've noted it before, that the COVID-19 crisis is not like a regular recession. The recovery path is pretty unclear at this point. We don't know what the recovery is going to look like. And that changes what the state budget needs and how the state budget layout might be, and the state budget framework might be. And it's important to note the recession has impacted those with the fewest resources the most severely, and public policy can help build an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable economic recovery. So there are a couple additional resources I want to point you to. There was a lot of information here, and the slide deck will be online, and I think you already have a copy as well. But there is on our website, there's also an issue brief about what the next state budget might look like and how it can be designed to meet the needs of New Hampshire citizens during and after the crisis. We also have a webinar on the governor's proposal There's also an older publication that goes through some of the details behind these state revenue sources. It's called Revenue and Review. There are some things that have changed since then, but the basic structure of the state's revenue system is covered in quite a bit of detail there. And I would encourage you to also check our resource pages on the NHFPI website on both budget and tax revenue, or revenue and tax topics. So we'll be updating those over the course of the budget biennium. So thank you very much for your time. You have some contact information here on the last slide, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand the baton to Becky because I don't see there are no detailed questions in the chats about any particular slides. Becky, you can go ahead and start, and I'll relinquish control here to you.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Phil, for that really excellent presentation, and also for providing all those NHFPI resources. I never fail to learn something new every time I listen to one of your webinars, including today. So part two, what I plan to address is the 2021 legislation that is currently being reviewed and being considered, as well as the governor's biennial budget that was, as Phil said, released on February 11th. And the possible impacts from both those, the legislation that has financial impacts and the governor's budget. So let's dive right in. Okay, so first I'd like to talk about what is included in the governor's budget that would have an impact for towns and cities. And they're categorized by the typical things, the typical state aid and revenue sharing that has been received by towns and cities for years and has been detailed as such on the LBA's state aid distribution spreadsheet, which you can find on New Hampshire General Court. But the first is municipal aid. That was, as Phil said, a policy decision in the last biennial budget where $20 million per year was allocated and distributed to municipalities as one-time revenue using that budget surplus. That is not included in the governor's budget for fiscal 22 and 23. And then the original revenue sharing under RSA 31A, which was distributed $25.2 million per year to municipalities up until the Great Recession. And from 2010 to the current year, in each biennium budget, in the budget trailer bill, usually known as HB2, that's where I heard one representative say that's where the magic occurs. But the trailer bill is the companion bill to the budget, which is makes any legislative changes which are necessary to implement the budget. And each year since 2010, there's been a paragraph in the trailer bill which suspends that revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was first established in 1969, and it was known as a return of revenues to cities and towns. And it was established because the state transformed how businesses were taxed, replacing the stock and trade tax, which was an essential part of the local property tax base. So in trade for that, in return for the municipalities losing that tax base, revenue sharing was created. Now, the highway block grants, this is, it's been reduced in the governor's budget due to the estimated revenue reduction in the highway road toll tax, which is known as the gas tax, and the state motor vehicle fees. And as Phil mentioned, that's because people are working from home and pretty much not traveling. So in 2022, it's funded at $33.6 million, down $3.1 million from fiscal year 21. And in fiscal year 23, it's funded at $35.8 million, which is still down $2.1 million from fiscal year 21. Municipal bridge aid, also part of the highway fund revenue. The funding for municipal bridge aid in the governor's budget was reduced by $1.6 million for the 2 years combined to 6 million distribution for each year. And notably, RSA 260-32B requires that funding to be 6.8 million annually, which it has been consistently. This reduction in the budget, it's $800,000 a year. In addition to that, in 2018, HB 17 was passed, which allocated an additional one-time appropriation of $10.4 million in funds, which were considered non-lapsing funds targeted for municipal red list bridge projects. And of that amount, of the $10.4 million, $8.1 million still remains, but that $8.1 million is budgeted to lapse in the governor's budget to the DOT's operating expenses. State aid grants, otherwise known as SAGs, the governor's budget does not fund the state's statutory 20% share of costs for wastewater projects beyond the level of funding that was approved in fiscal year 20. It does not include the funding that was originally appropriated in the current budget for 11 projects that are substantially complete and we're awaiting and expecting eligible state aid grant funding in this current biennium budget. So that those 11 projects are not funded in the next biennium budget, as well as 110 new eligible wastewater projects, which have been identified as DES being substantially complete and expected to be eligible for payments in fiscal year 22-23. It also, the major focus, something that the governor has really given a lot of attention to, is the meals and rooms tax. And I think this is just worth repeating his quote in his executive summary of his budget. It says, for the first time in more than a decade, HB 2, that's the trailer bill, which we haven't yet seen, it's due out any day now. HB 2 is introduced with a provision to suspend increases in the meals and rooms tax revenue sharing without a provision. I hope that's what I said. Without a provision to suspend increases in the meals and rooms tax revenue sharing to cities and towns in either year of the biennium. So through this budget, we are redoubling our commitment to revenue sharing for cities and towns, sending back cash, not costs, to our citizens. This budget continues municipal aid grants and expands revenue sharing to reduce the local property tax burden on our citizens. So the governor's budget does allow for up to $15 million in additional meals and rooms tax revenue sharing. And it would be $5 million is allowed for in fiscal year 22, and $10 million is allowed for in fiscal year 23. This is pretty much the same graph that Phil showed you earlier of the municipal aid and revenue sharing for municipalities, and it starts from 2008 through 2021. But what I've done is I've added the biennium budget that's being negotiated right now, fiscal year 22 and 23. So the last two bars represent what is in the governor's budget for towns and cities in fiscal year 22-23. And as Phil noticed, even though the state revenue and the economy recovered during recent years after the Great Recession, municipal revenue sharing and state aid didn't receive that same recovery. The state did not share that level of recovery. And in fact, the 2021 budgeted amount for revenue sharing is about $40 million below the 2009 level of revenue sharing before the recession. And unfortunately, the governor's budget, using that decrease will be further decreased. So we're looking at an even greater shortfall in revenue sharing. So there's several pieces of really important legislation that, if passed, could have very positive impacts on municipal budgets. And I'm just going to go through those briefly. SB 118 is also known as the Property Tax Relief Act. This would appropriate another 2 years of that municipal aid that we talked about, that one-time revenue, at $20 million per year for each of fiscal year 22 and 23. However, this is a little bit different. It requires that 60% of that revenue be used directly for property tax rate reduction. The Senate Finance Committee voted this bill ought to pass 4-3. It hasn't. That's where it is right now. It's still in committee. And then SB 72 is known as the Taxpayer Relief Act of 2021. It requires the state to contribute 15% of New Hampshire retirement contributions, employer contributions made by political subdivisions for teachers, police, and firefighters. Essentially, it restores a portion of that 35% that the state contributed up until 2009. This bill, if passed, would reduce municipal costs by $53 million in fiscal year 22, which, as you all know, would help significantly to offset that 20% increase in employer contribution rates that was certified this past year. HB 274 is also a retirement contribution bill. This bill would increase reduce the cost by 5% rather than 15% for employer contributions for teachers, police, and fire, and would have had a reduction in cost to municipalities of $17.66 million. Unfortunately, the House voted ITL to kill that bill yesterday, 189 to 168. It was a very close vote, just a 21 vote difference, and I think it's notable that 24 of the representatives were unexcused and were not present at the session yesterday, so their votes were not included. HB 398, this is the state aid grant bill. So HB 398 would appropriate $5.7 million for fiscal year 22 and $6.9 million for fiscal year 23. Providing funding for those 11 projects that should have received funding in this biennium, plus funding for the 110 new projects that have been identified by DES. That bill is in the House Finance Committee, and the House Finance Committee voted to retain the bill 21-0 so that they could work with it when they receive the governor's budget and are working to produce the House budget. HB 412 is a new state aid grant, or relatively new. It's for public water supplies, not a new statute on the books. There is a statute that says the state shall contribute to public water supply grants, but there hasn't been an appropriation for state water supply grants since 2008. This bill would appropriate $500,000 for each of fiscal year 22 and 23. And while that doesn't sound like a great deal of money, that money would be intended to pay the 20% of the amortization costs for approximately 15 projects that are on the waiting list for eligibility for those grants. SB 127 is an omnibus bill in the Senate, and Parts 7 and Parts 8 of that bill are state aid grant bills for wastewater treatment and public water supply treatment. They are identical to HB 398 and HB 412, with the goal being of getting public hearings in both bodies so that when the budget is finally reviewed, that those bills have had a good opportunity to receive lots of testimony and a lot of attention, and not just go away. And then again, the Meals and Rooms tax, SB 99. As I said before, Meals and Rooms tax is generating a lot of interest and a lot of discussion. And SB 99 repeals the catch-up formula, which caps the annual increase on Meals and Rooms revenue to municipalities. The statute requires, as Phil mentioned, that 40% of net meal and room revenues be distributed annually to municipalities. But as you all know, that has never happened. The catch-up formula was designed and put in place, intended to catch up that municipal distribution to the statutory 40%. The distribution amount in the current year, for example, is 21% to municipalities. And it's calculated this way. And this is important as we're looking at both this bill and at the governor's budget for what the amounts that he has allowed for in his budget. So what it does is it takes the previous year's meals and rooms tax distribution amount, and it adds to that municipalities' distribution 75% of the total year-over-year meals and rooms tax revenue. So municipalities would receive the previous year's distribution plus 75% of any increase in the total year-over-year revenue, up to, this is where the cap come in, up to a maximum of $5 million annually. The catch-up formula has been suspended in 10 of the last 12 years. SB 99, if passed, would nearly double the current distribution because it repeals that catch-up formula and requires that municipalities immediately start receiving that 40%. As an example of the impact that would have, under the current year's distribution, if that bill had been in place, 53.9 additional dollars would have been distributed to municipalities on top of the 68.8 million. And by the way, the 68.8 million that is distributed to municipalities, that's the same level that's been distributed since 2017. That bill is still in the Senate Finance Committee. They have not yet acted on it, and hopefully you all saw a legislative alert asking you to please email your senators in the Senate Ways and Means Committee, explaining to them the importance that that bill would have on your municipality, the services that it could provide, and as well as upon the residents, the local property tax rate. And through this increased discussion on meals and rooms tax, starting with SB 99, we took a look more deeply and did some projections based on the catch-up formula. And what this graph shows is from the current year of 2021, and I'm using the governor's projected meals and rooms tax revenue. And he was, as he said, or his governor's the budget director said, he's been very bullish on the meals and rooms tax projections. He's using the high end of the DRA's revenue projections because they believe that there's a lot of pent-up desire to get back out there, start traveling, and start eating, in restaurants, renting vehicles, and that type of thing. So what this looks at is the green bars are the total meals and rooms revenue projected using a 4% increase per year. And based on historical data, a 4% increase is over a 10, 12-year period. That was the average increase in the meals and rooms tax. So projecting a 4% increase into the future, as this chart goes to 2058, and then looking at the municipal distribution without suspending that formula in any year. So each year, the municipalities would increase, distribution would increase $5 million, which is the cap, So based under the current statute, municipal distribution would increase $5 million each year. The line at the top, however, shows that, and unfortunately my picture is covering up the percentages over to the right, but the percentages of municipal distribution is on the right-hand side. 40% is the top line. So as you can see, the percentage distribution goes down. It actually, it has gone on so long where the revenue has increased and the municipal distribution has been suspended, that delta, the 40% catch-up intention, can never be achieved. It's not possible under current statute. And this is going to walk you through what the governor's budget does with meals and rooms tax. So as I said before, his budget says that it allows for up to a $15 million increase in the meals and rooms tax distribution to municipalities. What he did that is different from any budget that's been presented in the last 10 years is he his budget does not suspend that catch-up formula for either fiscal year 22 or 23. So it leaves the catch-up formula alone. There won't be anything in the trailer bill, no magic language suspending the catch-up formula. So I just want to walk you down through this. As I said, the 2021 distribution is $68.8 million. The catch-up formula is not suspended. So the 2022 distribution in his budget would be based on the previous year's distribution amount of $68.8 million plus 75% of any revenue increase year over year. The revenue that we would be comparing to is for the fiscal year 22 distribution is based on fiscal year 21 meals and rooms tax revenue. And that's this year ending June 30th. Using the governor's projected revenue it's actually $3.5 million below the fiscal year 20 meals and rooms tax revenue. So there is no increase. There's a decrease therefore there would be no municipalities wouldn't receive any 75%. And so the cap doesn't apply either. So the fiscal year 22 distribution by suspending the formula would remain at $68.8 million. So rather than a $5 million increase, municipalities would not receive. They'd receive a zero increase in fiscal year 22. But there's a placeholder in that budget, should things really turn around between now and June 30th. Fiscal year 23 distribution, again, we'd have to use the $68.8 million because that would be the previous year's distribution amount. And then we would add 75% of the revenue increase year over year based on the budget's governor's budget revenue estimates, which are $13.2 million increase in revenue for fiscal year 22 over fiscal year 21. 75% of that amount would be $9.9 million. So without a cap, municipalities would have received an additional $9.9 million. But the suspension formula, as we mentioned, does have a cap, $5 million. And so municipalities would receive $73.8 million in fiscal year 23. An additional distribution of $5 million, not the $10 million that is the placeholder allowed for in the budget. So in reality, the total additional revenue sharing from meals and rooms tax under the governor's budget, we believe would be $5 million and not $15 million. And then this final slide, what I'd like to show you is this looks at, starting on the left, this is the current biennium's actual budget, and the numbers at the top are the total amount of revenue sharing and state aid that municipalities are receiving. The second two columns are the governor's budget, and the amounts used are based on actuality. So it's only a $5 million increase in meals and rooms tax over the 2 years. The third set of bars with 174 and 180 at the top, that is the governor's budget and SB 99, the meals and rooms tax bill passing. So if the governor's budget were to include the provisions of SB 99, that would be the distribution to municipalities. The next two, 139 and 145, that's the governor's budget, and adding to it SB 118, the $20 million municipal aid bill. So $20 million added to each of the fiscal years. And then the next set of bars, 125 and 132, that's the governor's budget with the state aid grant statutory requirements added to that. So that increases for both water supply and wastewater pollution control grants. And I'm really sorry, but you can't see the last two, the last bar, but the last two bars pretty much look like the meals and rooms tax, the SB 199. The last two bars represent if the governor's budget were to pass, and if SB 72, which is the retirement bill distributing, with the state contributing 15%, that's what the total distribution for municipalities would look like. All right, so that pretty much ends my slides, and but I did want to just pick up on one thing, one very important thing that Phil talked about, and that is the federal aid program. And as I'm sure you all know, there's a $1.9 trillion package that's being debated right now in Congress, which includes $350 billion for state and local aid. 1.526 billion of that money would come to New Hampshire, 966 million to the state, and 559 million to counties, cities, towns, and hopefully village districts. So with the state receiving those monies, or with towns and cities receiving those monies, that's clearly going to could have a very big impact on what happens with this whole budgeting process. That revenue does not have the same restrictions that the original CARES Act money has. It can be used for backfilling lost revenue, and the deadline on it is far out into the future. So it's not, it's very different from the CARES Act. And I just, we're watching that very closely, and, it could have a really positive impact, both if what goes to the state and what goes directly to towns and cities. So that concludes my presentation. Tim, I'm going to turn it back to you for any questions.
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you, Phil. Members, you have probably heard from the two more prominent officials, experts, I should say, with dealing with federal, state, local, municipal budgets. Thank you both for a very comprehensive and thorough overview. It was a lot of information to digest, but we thank you for providing those resources to us. Also, you've probably have heard in Becky's voice the need for member advocacy. We can't stress enough how your voices at the local level really impact the votes at the legislature. So if you've not yet been involved, we hope that you will. And the best place to get involved are on funding issues, because then you can bring home the bacon to your local residents. With that, I'm not seeing any questions, but we do have upcoming, we've got 3 complimentary events this spring, the workings of a planning board. We have Steve Buckley, Nate Grays, and Principal Planner Michael Klass from the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives, who will discuss the workings of a planning board. That's a 2-hour workshop. It's free. It's March 23rd. We also have the U.S. Department of Labor and the New Hampshire Department of Labor, who have come together to give a presentation called 2021 Labor Law Workshop for Municipalities. This is a workshop being hosted by federal and state officials at their WebEx platform, so you'll need to register there. It will look different when you register. Don't be alarmed by that, and we hope that you'll join us for that 3-hour free virtual workshop on Wednesday, March 24th. And then our very popular 2021 local officials workshops geared, these are again virtual, they're free to our members. It's a full day workshop, and you're invited to join us on either Tuesday, April 6th, or Tuesday, May 18th, and the registration is open for that. And with that, I think we are done for the day. I'm not seeing any questions. I'd like to thank our members for sticking with us. We went past our time. And again, a quick thanks to Becky and Phil. I don't know if you had any last-minute comments, folks. And if not, I will conclude the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.